Welcome back to the darkest corner of the internet. If you love true scary stories, forgotten legends, and psychological horror documentaries that will keep you awake at night, you are in the right place. Lock your doors, turn off the lights, and let's begin. They always tell you never to sleep with your closet door open, but they never tell you why. In 2024, a small, isolated town in Alaska completely vanished from government records. No news reports, no internet leaks, and zero cell service. But 3 weeks ago, an encrypted file was uploaded to the dark web, containing 40 minutes of audio. What you are about to hear is the recovered recording of the final house in that town, and the terrifying reason why the last survivor whispered, "It learned how to mimic my mother's voice." If you are watching this alone in the dark, close your closet door right now, because tonight we are opening the forbidden file. The coordinates led to a blank spot on the map. In the freezing depths of Alaska, a small mining town named Anvik Creek used to exist. But if you search for it today, you will find nothing. No satellite images, no government census, nothing. It was completely wiped out. The world was told it was a forced evacuation due to a toxic gas leak, but the dark web file revealed a much more sinister reality. It all began in November when the sun disappeared for the long winter. A family of 3, Arthur, his wife Elena, and their 19-year-old son Julian, were trapped in their cabin during a brutal blizzard. The power lines had snapped, leaving the entire town in pitch darkness. The only sound outside was the howling wind, or so they thought. On the third night of the storm, while Arthur was checking the basement generator, Elena heard a faint tapping on the front door. It wasn't the wind, it was rhythmic. 3 slow knocks. Tap, tap, tap. When Elena looked through the frosted glass, she saw a figure standing in a blinding snowstorm. It looked exactly like Arthur. Same heavy winter jacket, same posture, but Arthur was supposed to be downstairs. Before she could process the confusion, a voice came from the other side of the door. It sounded identical to her husband, but the cadence was wrong. Too slow, too robotic. It said, "Elena, it's freezing out here. Let me in." At that exact moment, the basement door behind her creaked open, and the real Arthur walked up the stairs, holding his flashlight. He looked at his terrified wife, then at the front door. The voice outside repeated, with the exact same artificial tone, "Elena, it's freezing out here. Let me in." Arthur grabbed his shotgun, his hands trembling. He yelled toward the door, demanding to know who was there. The entity outside fell dead silent. Then the most horrifying thing happened. The thing outside didn't run away. Instead, it began to shift its voice. Right in front of their ears, the voice transformed from Arthur's deep tone into Elena's own voice, repeating the exact words she had said to Arthur just an hour ago. "Did you fix the generator, honey?" It wasn't just a monster. It was a mirror. The real Arthur and Elena stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, their breathing shallow, as the entity outside continued to echo Elena's own voice back to them. Julian, who had been watching from the hallway, gripped the wooden railing so hard his knuckles turned white. The voice outside didn't stop. It began combining their sentences, mixing Arthur's robotic cadence with Elena's panic, creating a sickening, distorted version of a conversation they had just had hours ago. Arthur slowly moved toward the window, keeping his shotgun raised, but as the beam of his flashlight hit the frosted glass, his heart dropped. There were no footprints in the deep snow leading up to the porch. Whatever was standing on the other side of the door was leaving absolutely no physical trace on the ground. Suddenly, the voice stopped mimicking. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the cabin, interrupted only by the rhythmic hum of the failing basement generator. Then, a metallic scratching sound began, not on the front door, but directly above their heads, on the roof. Something heavy was dragging itself across the frozen shingles, moving with unnatural speed toward the back of the house where the bedrooms were located. Arthur realized with horror that they hadn't checked the second-floor windows. He ordered Julian and Elena to stay in the kitchen while he went up the stairs, his boots creaking softly with every step. The air on the second floor was freezing, far colder than the rest of the house, and a strange chemical smell of ozone and wet copper filled the hallway. Arthur approached Julian's bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could see the window was wide open, letting the brutal Arctic wind howl inside. But what made him freeze was the shadow stretched across the bedroom wall. It was a silhouette of a person, but the limbs were completely elongated, bending at sharp, impossible angles. Before Arthur could pull the trigger of his shotgun, the shadow on the wall slowly turned its head toward him, and from inside the pitch-black bedroom, a voice whispered in the dark. It didn't sound like a monster anymore. It sounded exactly like Julian, crying out in pure agony. "Dad, it's inside the closet. Please don't let it look at me." But Arthur knew, with absolute certainty, that the real Julian was standing right downstairs in the kitchen. Arthur's blood ran completely cold. From downstairs, he could hear the faint, muffled voice of the real Julian calling out to him. But the entity inside the dark bedroom kept whispering in that exact same teenage voice, sobbing, "Dad, it's mimicking me now. Don't trust the one downstairs." Arthur's mind fractured. He couldn't move, paralyzed by the psychological horror of not knowing which voice belonged to his actual son. Suddenly, the elongated shadow on the wall began to physically peel itself off the drywall. It stepped into the dim beam of Arthur's flashlight. The creature had no skin, just a shifting mass of pitch-black obsidian flesh that stretched and bent at impossible spider-like angles. It had no face, but as it spoke, the flesh around its throat rippled violently, vibrating to force out Julian's human voice. Terror turned into survival instinct. Arthur raised his shotgun and fired directly into the center of the mass. The blast tore through the room, shattering the windows and sending shards of frozen glass exploding into the hallway. The freezing Arctic wind roared inside, but the entity didn't fall. Instead, it unleashed a deafening multi-tone shriek, a sickening choir of Arthur, Elena, and Julian's voices screaming in agony all at once. Panic-stricken, Arthur turned and bolted down the stairs, his chest heaving. When he reached the kitchen, the beam of his flashlight caught a sight that made him drop to his knees. Under the dining table, huddled in fear, were not 2 people, but 4. There were 2 identical versions of Elena and 2 identical versions of Julian. They were clawing at each other, crying, each one screaming that the one next to them was the monster. They shared the same memories, the same tears, and the exact same terrified expressions. The room became a psychological battleground of screams, making it impossible to separate the humans from the mimics. And then the ultimate disaster struck. The steady hum of the basement generator sputtered, gasped, and died completely. The cabin plunged into a total, suffocating darkness. In the black silence that followed, 4 different voices from 4 different corners of the room whispered in perfect unison. The generator didn't fail Arthur. The sound of his own voice, vibrating from the mouths of the elongated monstrosities, shattered the last of Arthur's sanity. The splintering wood of the basement door finally gave way with a deafening crash, and the sound of dozens of heavy, shuffling footsteps flooded into the pitch-black kitchen. The freezing Arctic fog was now so thick inside the house that Arthur could barely breathe, his lungs burning with the sudden smell of ozone and frozen earth. He could hear the distinct voices of their missing neighbors, people from the town who had supposedly evacuated weeks ago, all whispering from the darkness, calling out his name in a terrifying, chaotic symphony of fake human grief. Driven by pure panic, Arthur raised his shotgun into the black mist and fired blindly until the weapon clicked empty. The flashes of gunfire illuminated the room for a fraction of a second, revealing a nightmare that would haunt any survivor forever. The room was packed wall to wall with towering, faceless shapes, their limbs bent like broken spiders, all wearing the torn winter jackets of the townspeople, their jaws unhinged to emit the voices of the dead. But the bullets did nothing to the fog or the flesh. A cold, heavy grip clamped down on Arthur's ankle, dragging him violently across the floorboards toward the center of the kitchen. He screamed, kicking wildly, until another pair of hands caught his arms. In the blinding dark, a voice whispered right above his face. It was Julian's voice, but it was sobbing with genuine, heartbreaking terror. "Dad, I found a flashlight. Follow my voice. The front door is open. Simultaneously, a few feet away, another Julian screamed, "Dad, don't trust him. I'm over here by the window. He's pulling you into the dark." Arthur was being torn apart psychologically. If he chose the wrong voice, he would hand himself over to the entity. He had to make a choice in less than a second, as the temperature in the room dropped to an impossible, deadly freezing point. Summoning every ounce of strength left in his body, Arthur broke his right arm free, reached into his pocket, and pulled out his emergency hunting flare. With a harsh strike, the flare ignited, filling the entire kitchen with a blinding, aggressive red glow. The sudden, intense light caused the towering entities to let out a collective, multi-tone shriek of agony, covering their faceless heads as the red smoke began to fill the room. In that crimson light, Arthur looked down at the two Julians holding on to him. To his absolute horror, both of their faces were melting like wet wax, their human features dripping off to reveal the smooth obsidian flesh underneath. Neither of them was his son. The real Julian and Elena were already gone, or perhaps they had never even made it back to the kitchen after the generator failed. Arthur didn't look back. He scrambled to his feet, holding the burning red flare like a weapon, and threw himself through the shattered frame of the kitchen window, tumbling out into the deep, unforgiving Alaskan snowstorm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he kept running, blindly sprinting into the whiteout conditions of the forest, guided only by the dying red light in his hand. Behind him, the cabin stood like a dark monument in the blizzard, and from every single broken window, the combined voices of Elena, Julian, and Arthur himself were screaming out into the storm, begging him to come back inside, because it was too cold out there. Hours later, the flare burned out, leaving Arthur alone in the vast, dark, frozen wilderness. His fingers were black with frostbite, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as hypothermia began to take over his mind. As his vision started to fade into a peaceful, deadly sleep, the howling of the wind around him began to change. The wind wasn't whistling through the trees anymore. It was shifting, modulating, and molding itself into the familiar, gentle voice of his mother, whispering softly from the snowbanks right beside his ear, "Arthur, you can sleep now. You're finally safe." And as Arthur closed his eyes for the last time, letting the freezing darkness consume him, he realized the ultimate terrifying truth of Anvik Creek. The entity didn't just mimic people, it was mimicking the entire world, and there was nowhere left to run. If that ending gave you chills, do not look toward your window tonight. If you want to survive more elite dark storytelling and psychological horror documentaries, smash that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on what truly happened to Anvik Creek, if you dare. Sleep well tonight, and remember, if you hear a familiar voice calling your name from the dark, do not answer.